My daughter-in-law walked into my kitchen on a Tuesday morning, set her coffee mug on the counter without asking, and told me that her parents would be arriving Friday. I smiled, nodded, and waited until she left the room before I picked up my phone. That phone call changed everything. But I'm getting ahead of myself. You need to understand what this house means before you understand what happened inside it. I built this place with my own hands. Not metaphorically. I poured the foundation, framed every wall, ran the electrical, laid the hardwood floors in the hallway that my late wife Margaret used to slide across in her socks every Christmas morning. I started construction in 1987 and moved my family in on a Saturday in October when the oak trees out front were burning orange and my oldest boy was 6 years old and thought the whole thing was a castle. It took me 4 years to finish it properly. 4 years of evenings after work, weekends, holidays. Every room in this house carries a memory I built on purpose. Margaret died 11 years ago, breast cancer, found too late, gone too fast. After that, the house became something different. It became the place where grief lived alongside everything else. Her garden out back still comes up every spring because I tend it. Her reading chair is still by the window in the front room because I put it there and nobody asked me to move it. The house is mine in every way a house can belong to a person. I have 2 children. Derek is 41. He is a good man, mostly. He works in commercial real estate, makes decent money, married Vanessa 8 years ago in a ceremony at a vineyard 2 hours north of here. My daughter Claire is 38. She lives in Portland with her wife and their twin boys and calls me every Sunday without fail. Vanessa is a complicated woman. I say that charitably. She is organized, ambitious, and used to getting what she decides she wants. She has a way of presenting things not as requests but as settled facts, as though the conversation where you might object already happened in her head, and she already won. When she and Derek were first married, I chalked it up to personality. I liked her energy. I thought she would be good for Derek, who has always needed someone to push him a little. Over the years, though, I started to notice a pattern. Family dinners where decisions had already been made before anyone sat down. Holidays where the itinerary appeared fully formed without consultation. Small things, mostly. Things I let go because Margaret always said that peace in a family costs something and it's usually worth paying. I paid it. I kept quiet more often than I should have. Vanessa's parents are Gerald and Phyllis Horn. Gerald is a retired civil engineer from outside Columbus. Phyllis taught 4th grade for 30 years. They are not bad people. Gerald tells the same 3 fishing stories on rotation and laughs at all of them himself. Phyllis brings a Jell-O salad to every gathering that nobody eats but nobody says anything about. I have known them for 8 years. I have always been cordial. The trouble started at Easter. We were all at my house for Easter dinner, which had been the tradition since before Derek and Vanessa were married. I cooked the ham myself, made Margaret's recipe for twice-baked potatoes, set the table in the dining room with the good china. Gerald and Phyllis drove in from Columbus. Claire flew in from Portland with her family. It was full and loud and good, the way Easter at my house is supposed to be. After dinner, while the kids were in the backyard and Claire was helping me with dishes, Vanessa asked Derek to come with her into the living room. I could hear them talking, but not the words. Claire looked at me, and I looked at her, and neither of us said anything. When Vanessa came back into the kitchen, she had a particular expression on her face, the one I had learned to recognize, the one that meant the conversation in her head was already over. She said, "Walter, we've been thinking." I handed Claire a dish to dry and waited. She said that Gerald and Phyllis were getting older. She said that their house in Columbus had become too much for them to maintain. She said that Derek had been concerned about them for months, which was news to me because Derek had not mentioned it once. She said that she had been looking at options, and that the most sensible option, the one that made the most financial sense and the most family sense, was for Gerald and Phyllis to move in here. I set down the dish I was holding. I said, "Move in here." She said yes. She said the house was large enough, that the guest suite on the first floor was perfect, that it would save Gerald and Phyllis the cost of assisted living or a smaller rental, and that it would give everyone peace of mind. I said, "This is my house." Vanessa smiled, not warmly. She said she knew that, of course, and that they would all work out the details together, but that she and Derek felt it was the right thing, and they were hoping I would see it that way too. Claire put down her dish towel very slowly and deliberately and said, "Vanessa." Vanessa said, "Claire, I know this might seem sudden, but..." Claire said, "This is Dad's house." Vanessa said that she was aware of that. Claire said, "You're asking our father to share his home with your parents, people he barely knows." Vanessa said she wouldn't characterize it as barely knowing them. I put my hand on Claire's arm because I could feel the conversation heading somewhere we would all regret at Easter dinner. I said I needed to think about it and I would let them know. Vanessa said, "Of course, take your time." She said it the way people say, "Take your time," when they have already decided there is no time to take. That night, after everyone left, I sat in Margaret's chair by the front window for a long time. I looked at the oak trees she helped me plant in the front yard. I thought about the 4 years I spent building this house, and the 34 years I spent living in it, and the 11 years since I had been living in it alone, taking care of it alone, keeping it the way Margaret and I always meant for it to be. I thought about all the people who had sat at my kitchen table over the years. There were more than most people knew. After Margaret and I moved in, the neighborhood was young. Lots of families, lots of kids. There was a boy named Marcus who lived 2 doors down, whose father left when Marcus was 8, and whose mother worked 2 jobs and sometimes 3. Marcus ate at our table more nights than not for about 6 years. He called Margaret Miss M, and he called me Mr. Walt, and when he graduated from high school with a scholarship to study engineering, he stood in my driveway in his cap and gown and cried because Margaret had died the year before and couldn't see it. There was a girl named Sujin whose family moved into the neighborhood when she was 12 and spoke almost no English. Her parents worked constantly, and Sujin spent a lot of afternoons at our house because Margaret had patience and a dictionary and an inexhaustible willingness to sit at the kitchen table and work through whatever needed working through. Sujin is a physician now, an oncologist. She sends me a card every year on Margaret's birthday. There was a teenager named Devin who came to me through a different channel. His mother called me because I had done some construction work on her church and she had heard I was trustworthy. Devin was 16 and angry and pointed in the wrong direction, and his mother was terrified. I gave him a job on one of my sites. I made him work. I made him show up on time and do it right, and do it again if it wasn't right the first time. I told him once that the things you build with your hands are the things you can't lie to yourself about. Either the wall is plumb or it isn't. Either you did the work or you didn't. He listened more than he let on. Devin is a general contractor now in Charlotte. He runs a crew of 32 people, and I have never once in my life been more proud of something I didn't do myself. There were others. Tommy, who came to me at 17 through a program the county ran, whose foster placement had just broken down. He stayed in the guest room for 8 months and helped me re-roof the back addition and ate everything in the refrigerator. He is a lieutenant in the fire department now. There was Angela, who was Sujin's friend, who wound up spending more time here than at her own house, for reasons she never fully explained, and I never fully pressed because sometimes what a kid needs is a place that doesn't require explanation. Angela runs a nonprofit in Atlanta that provides after-school programs to about 400 children annually. I am not telling you this to make myself sound like a saint. I am telling you this so you understand that my house is not just walls and floors. It is not just the asset my daughter-in-law was calculating in her head at the Easter table. It is a place that has meant something to a lot of people over a lot of years. And I was not willing to hand it over to strangers because Vanessa had decided it made family sense. I let 2 weeks go by. I did not call Derek. I thought about it plenty. I sat with it. Then on a Tuesday morning, Vanessa came back. She let herself in with the key Derek had given her, which I had never objected to because I had never expected to need to. She poured herself coffee from my pot and leaned against my counter and told me that her parents would be arriving Friday. She said she and Derek had arranged a moving truck. She said the guest suite would need a few things cleared out, nothing major, and she could handle that herself. She didn't want me to have to do it. I looked at her for a long moment. I said, "Vanessa, I told you I needed to think about it." She said she knew, and she understood, and she and Derek had thought about it a great deal too, and they both felt that this was the right thing for the family. She said Gerald and Phyllis were family, and that this house was Derek's family home, and that it was the right place for family to be. I noticed what she said. Derek's family home, not my house. Derek's family home. I asked her what Derek had to say about this. She said Derek was on board. I said I would like to hear that from Derek. She pulled out her phone, called him, and handed it to me. My son's voice came through, and he said, Dad, I think this could be really good. Vanessa has thought it all through. I said, This is my house, Derek. He said he knew that. He said, Of course. He said, But we're all family, Dad, and family takes care of family. I said, Gerald and Phyllis are not my family. There was a pause. Then Derek said they were Vanessa's family, and Vanessa was his family, and he was my family, and he thought I was being closed-minded about this. I said, All right. He said, Really? I said, I'll think about what you've said. And I hung up. Vanessa took her phone back and smiled the smile of someone who had already won. I said, The coffee was from this morning. It's a few hours old. I'll make a fresh pot if you want to stay. She said she had things to do and left. When the door closed behind her, I went to the window and watched her car pull out of the driveway. Then I picked up my phone and I started making calls. The first call was to my attorney, Barbara Nwosu, who has handled my legal affairs for 20 years. I told her what was happening. I told her I wanted to know exactly where I stood. She told me very clearly. The house was in my name alone. It had been since Margaret died. There was no legal mechanism by which Vanessa or Derek or anyone else could compel me to allow anyone to live in it. She also said, gently, that she thought I should document what had been said to me and when. I thanked her. Then I called Claire. Claire said several things I will not repeat verbatim because some of them were not appropriate for all audiences. Then I started calling the others. I called Marcus, who is 43 now, and lives 40 minutes away. I called Sujin, who had just finished a night shift but said she would be there. I called Devin, who said he would drive up from Charlotte, which is almost 7 hours, and I told him he didn't have to do that, and he said, Don't be ridiculous, Mr. Walt. I called Tommy, who said he was off shift Friday, and had been waiting for me to need something for years. I called Angela, who cleared her Friday afternoon without a single question. I called a dozen others. People who had sat at my table or worked on my sites or come to me at some point in their lives when they needed something solid to stand on. I did not tell any of them what to do. I told each of them the same thing. I would like you to be here Friday morning if you can. That's all. Thursday night, Derek called me. He sounded uncomfortable. He said Vanessa had been talking to the movers and everything was set for 10 in the morning. He said he hoped I had made peace with it. He said he knew it was an adjustment. I said, Derek, I need you to hear something. He said, Okay. I said, I have never once in your life failed to tell you the truth. Not when it was easy, and not when it was hard. So I'm telling you now, what your wife is doing is wrong, not inconvenient, not complicated. Wrong. She is trying to move people into my home without my consent, using your voice to do it, and she has been treating this house as an asset she can allocate rather than a place that belongs to me. I want you to think about that tonight. Derek was quiet for a long time. Then he said, Dad, Vanessa just wants what's best for everyone. I said, I know you believe that. He said good night and hung up. He didn't sound confident. He sounded like a man who had been told something he didn't quite want to think about. Friday morning I was up at 5:30. I made a full pot of coffee, and I sat at my kitchen table, and I thought about Margaret. I thought about the morning we moved in, how she stood in the middle of this kitchen with sawdust still on the floor and said, This is it. Walt, this is the place. I thought about how she would have handled this, and I decided she would have done exactly what I was about to do, except faster, and with less patience for the preliminary nonsense. Claire arrived at 7:15. She had driven down from the airport, red-eye from Portland, and she walked in the front door with her overnight bag, and her jaw set and hugged me for a long time without saying anything. Then she poured herself coffee and sat across from me at the table, and we talked through everything quietly until 8. Marcus arrived at 8:30 and made himself at home the way he has for 30 years. He put on a second pot of coffee and stood at the kitchen window looking out at the backyard and said, Garden looks good, Mr. Walt. I said, Margaret's peonies came back strong this year. He nodded like that, settled something. Tommy came at 9 with Devin, who had driven through the night. Devin looked tired and said he was fine and drank 3 cups of coffee in sequence. Sujin arrived at 9:15, still in her work clothes, apologized for not having time to change, and I told her she was perfect. By 9:45, there were people throughout my house. In the kitchen, in the living room, on the front porch. Old friends, people I had known for decades, people who knew every corner of this place as well as I did. Angela had brought her sister, who I had met twice, but who Angela said wanted to be here. A man named Robert, who had worked on my construction crew for 12 years in the 90s, showed up in his truck with two of his sons who had also worked for me at various points. A woman named Helen, who had been Margaret's closest friend, and who still came to tend the garden twice a year, showed up with a casserole, because Helen's response to any situation is to bring food. Just before 10, a moving truck turned onto my street. Behind it was Derek's car, and behind Derek's car was a silver sedan I recognized as Gerald and Phyllis's. They pulled into my driveway. Vanessa got out first. She was talking on her phone, and she looked up at my house and stopped. The front porch had 8 people on it. The driveway had 6 more. Through the front window, you could see people inside. Vanessa stood very still. Then Derek got out of the car and stood beside her, and I watched his face go through several things in about 4 seconds. I walked out onto the porch. Vanessa said, "Walter, what is this?" I said, "These are my family." She looked around. She said, "I don't understand." I said, "I know you don't. Come up and I'll explain it." Gerald and Phyllis had gotten out of their car. Gerald looked confused. Phyllis looked like she was already calculating whether she should apologize to someone and wasn't sure who. I invited everyone inside. All of them. Vanessa, Derek, Gerald, Phyllis. I brought them into the living room where people moved to make space. And I stood in the middle of the room I built, and I said what I had been thinking about for 2 weeks. I said, "Vanessa, you have told me several times now that this is Derek's family home, and that family should be here. I'd like to talk about that word for a minute." She started to say something, and I held up one hand gently. I said, "I'm not angry. I just want you to listen." I said, "Marcus over there has been sitting at my kitchen table since he was 8 years old. His mother worked nights, and I watched him do his homework in that chair by the window for 6 years. Devin drove 7 hours last night to be here this morning because when he was 16 and pointed in the wrong direction, I gave him something to do with his hands and his time. Sujin is going to go home and sleep after this because she just worked a 12-hour shift. But she came because this house is where she learned to read English, and she considers it home." I let that sit for a second. Then I said, "These are not strangers I'm describing. These are the people who have been in and out of this house for decades. They know where the good mugs are kept. They know Margaret's rose bush in the backyard and why it's still there. When I say this is my family home, these are the people I mean." Derek's face had been changing the whole time I was talking. He was looking at Marcus, who he had known since childhood. He was looking at Tommy, who had been at our house for holidays when Derek was in middle school. He was looking at Devin, who Derek had met a dozen times at my birthday dinners. Vanessa said, "Walter, with respect, that's a very different situation from..." Claire said, "From what?" Her voice was quiet and precise. "From family? What makes your parents more family to our father than the people standing in this room?" Vanessa looked at her. Claire said, "You told my father that your parents should live here because this is family property and family should be together. But your parents are not his family. They are your family. Walter has never once been to their home. He's shared holiday dinners with them 8 times in 8 years. And the people standing in this room right now," she gestured around, "have been part of his life for 20 and 30, and in some cases 40 years. She said, "You didn't ask him. You decided. There's a difference." Gerald, who had been standing near the doorway with his hands in his pockets, said quietly, "Vanessa." Vanessa looked at her father. Gerald said, "I didn't know it was going to be like this." His voice was careful. He said, "When you said you'd talked everything through with Walter, I assumed he stopped. He looked at me. He said, 'Walter, I apologize. This was not how we thought it was being handled.'" Phyllis put her hand on her husband's arm and nodded. Vanessa said, "Dad, this is fine." "Everything is," Gerald said. "It's not fine, sweetheart." He said it gently, but without any give in it. He said, "This is this man's home. We are not moving into a man's home without his invitation." He looked at me again and said, "I am sorry, Walter. Truly." The room was quiet. Vanessa looked at Derek. Derek was looking at the floor. Then he looked up at me, and he looked like he had looked when he was a boy. And he knew he had done something wrong. That particular expression that is part embarrassment and part grief, because he could see clearly what he had let happen. He said, "Dad." He said, "Derek." He said, "I'm sorry." He said it slowly, working through it. I kept telling myself Vanessa had thought it all through and that it would be fine once you got used to the idea. That was, he stopped. He said, "That was cowardly." I said, "I know you weren't trying to hurt me." He said, "I know. That's almost worse." Vanessa was standing very still. She was not looking at anyone. She had the look of a person processing something that doesn't fit the frame they built for it. I said, "Vanessa." She looked at me. I said, "I want to say something to you that I'd like you to hear, as someone who genuinely wishes things to go well between us, because I do." I said, "You love Derek. I have never doubted that. And you love your parents. I understand that wanting to take care of them comes from a real and good place." I said, "But you treated my home like a resource you had the right to allocate. You did not ask me. You informed me. And when I said I needed time to think, you came back and told me the truck would arrive Friday. That was not respectful." She was quiet. I said, "Gerald and Phyllis need support. That is a real problem and it deserves a real solution. I will help you look for one. I know contractors in Columbus who do home modification work. I know a woman who runs a senior services coordination organization who is exceptional. I will help." I said, "But I will not be moved out of the way in my own home." Vanessa took a breath. Then she said, "You're right." She said it plainly, without decoration. "You're right, and I handled this badly." She looked at Derek. She looked at her father. She looked back at me. She said, "I'm sorry, Walter." I believe she meant it. Phyllis, who had been quiet the entire time, said, "What a beautiful home this is." She said it like she was seeing it for the first time, which, in a way, she was. She looked at the reading chair by the window and said, "Is that a Stickley?" I said it was. I said Margaret found it at an estate sale in 1994. Phyllis smiled and said, "She had good taste." I said, "She had excellent taste." Devin caught my eye from across the room, and I could see him trying not to smile, and I thought about the 16-year-old he had been when I handed him a set of framing squares and told him the wall doesn't care how you feel about it. It's either straight or it isn't. After a while, the moving truck drove away. Gerald and Phyllis stayed for coffee because Phyllis asked if she could see the garden, and I said of course. We walked out together through the back door, and she stood at the edge of Margaret's garden and looked at the peonies and the dahlias coming up along the fence line, and she said, "How long have these been here?" I said since 1994, mostly. A few new additions over the years. She said, "Someone tended these carefully." I said, "Two someones. For a while." She nodded in that way. Older people nod when they understand exactly what you mean and don't need you to say more. Gerald came and stood beside her and put his hand on the small of her back, the way old married people do without thinking about it. He said, "I'll tell you what, Walter, that's a fine piece of property. You built this yourself?" I said I did. He said, "Then you understand what it means to put yourself into something." I said I did. He said, "I'm truly sorry about all of this." I told him he had nothing to apologize for. I told him the apology belonged to the situation, not to him. Inside, I could hear the voices of my kitchen filling up the way they used to. Marcus laughing at something Devin said. Claire explaining something to Sujin. Tommy in the hallway with Robert's sons talking about something in that particular low construction worker register that sounds like the rumble of foundation work. Helen had unwrapped her casserole and was looking for serving utensils with the confidence of a woman who has located serving utensils in 200 kitchens. Derek came out and stood beside me in the garden. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I forgot, a little, about all of them. How many there were. How long." I said, "You had your own life to live." He said, "That's not an excuse." I said, "No, but it's a reason. There's a difference." He said, "I love her, Dad. Vanessa. I need you to know that even after—" I said, "I know you do. And she loves you. Love isn't the thing that was missing from this situation." He thought about that. He said, "What was missing?" I said, "She needed someone to push back, and you didn't." He was quiet. I said, "That's what I mean when I say it was cowardly. I don't mean you're a coward. I mean you took the easier path when a harder one was right." I said, "You know the difference. I built enough things with you when you were young to know that you know the difference." He turned and looked at me, and I could see something in his face that I recognized because I had put it there a long time ago. That thing a father wants to leave in a son, the capacity to see what's actually true and not look away from it. He said, "I'm going to do better." I said, "I know you are." We stood there for a while in Margaret's garden, with the spring coming through, the peonies showing the first color of the season, the dahlias still just spears of green. After a bit, I put my arm around my son's shoulders, and he leaned into it the way he hadn't in years, the way he used to when he was small and the world hadn't sorted itself out yet. And we stood like that in the yard of the house I built with my hands until Helen appeared in the back doorway and announced that if nobody came inside in the next 60 seconds, she was eating the casserole herself. Everybody laughed. Even Vanessa. That night, after everyone had gone, after Gerald and Phyllis had driven back toward a hotel I had recommended downtown, and Derek and Vanessa had left in their car with considerably more silence between them than they had arrived with, and after Claire had fallen asleep on the couch watching television with her shoes off, I sat in Margaret's chair. The house was quiet in the way it gets after it has been full of people. A good quiet. The kind that holds the sound of what just happened instead of just being empty. I thought about what Derek had asked me out in the garden. What was missing? He had asked it like it was a question about Vanessa, but I knew it was also a question about himself. What do you do when someone you love stops pushing back? When they let you go wrong because stopping you is harder than agreeing with you? Derek had sat through every conversation with Vanessa where this plan was made, and he had told himself it would be fine. He had handed me a phone and asked me to accept the thing his wife had already decided. He had called it family logic when the logic had actually been convenience, and he had let it happen because pushing back on the person you love is the hardest work there is. Margaret used to push back on me. Not cruelly, not constantly, but when it mattered, she would sit across from me at this very kitchen table and say, "Walt, I need you to hear me say something." And she would say it. And sometimes I agreed right away, and sometimes I didn't agree until later, and once or twice I didn't agree at all. But she always said it. That was how we stayed honest with each other across 36 years. That was how love worked in this house. I thought about Devin, 17 years old, angry and burning in the wrong direction, learning that the wall doesn't care how you feel about it. You can hate the job and resent the early morning and be furious at the person who handed you the level, but the wall tells the truth anyway. Plum or not plum. True or not true. You can build beautiful things if you're willing to hear the truth of it. I looked at the oak trees through the front window, the same trees Margaret and I planted when this house was new, when Derek was small, when none of what happened this week had happened yet. They were 50 feet tall now, and the new leaves were just coming in, that particular light green that only exists in April, that color that means everything that was dormant is still alive. I reached over and turned the lamp off. The room went dark, except for the streetlight coming through the leaves of Margaret's oak trees, and the house settled into the night the way it always does, the way it has for 34 years, the way it was built to do. Friday's moving truck came back on Saturday morning, not for Gerald and Phyllis. Vanessa had sent it to return the furniture she'd already moved into the guest suite without my knowledge, 3 pieces that had appeared there while I wasn't home sometime in the week before. I hadn't said anything about that at the time. I said something about it Saturday morning when I met the driver at the door and handed him the inventory list I had written down, item by item, and told him where each piece was. The driver looked at the list and looked at me and said, "She said you'd have a list." I said, "I've been making lists my whole life." He said, "Good for you, man." He seemed like he meant it. The guest room was empty again by noon. I put back the things that belonged there, the quilt Margaret made that lived on the chair in the corner, the small framed print on the wall that Devin had found at a market years ago and brought me as a gift, the reading lamp I'd rewired myself in 1998. I straightened the quilt and stood in the doorway for a moment looking at the room. Then I went downstairs and made lunch and ate it at my own table in my own kitchen, with the windows open and the spring air coming through and Margaret's garden visible from where I sat. Later that afternoon, Claire woke up from her nap and came downstairs and said, "How are you?" I said, "I'm good." She said, "Really?" I said, "Really?" She stood in the kitchen for a moment, looking at me with that particular look she inherited from her mother, the one that sees whether you are telling the truth or whether you are telling the version that requires less from everyone else. She said, "Okay." She said, "I'm going to call you every Sunday like always, but I'm also going to call you Thursday nights for a while." I said that wasn't necessary. She said, "I know, I want to." She said, "And if Derek and Vanessa do anything," I said, "Derek will be fine. Vanessa will come around." I said, "They just needed someone to push back." Claire said, "You pushed back." I said, "I did." She said, "Mom would have pushed back faster." I laughed. She was not wrong. Margaret would have had the moving truck turned around before it reached our street. I said, "Your mother had a gift for efficiency." Claire said, "She had a gift for everything." We stood in the kitchen together and didn't say anything for a while, which is a thing we do sometimes. The two of us, just standing in the house where we all grew up and letting it be what it is. A house where someone built something and someone else made it a home, and the two things together became something more than either one. 3 weeks later, Gerald called me. He said he and Phyllis had found an apartment in a community 40 minutes from Derek and Vanessa's house. He said it had a small patio, and Phyllis was excited about container gardening. He said the building had a community workshop in the basement with decent tools, and he was looking forward to it. He said, "I owe you one for not making this worse than it needed to be." I said he didn't owe me anything. He said, "Vanessa got her pushback instinct from Phyllis. I want you to know that. Neither of them was raised to be mean. They were raised to solve problems aggressively, which is mostly a good thing." He said, "She's embarrassed. She won't say that, but she is." I said, "I know." He said, "Derek's a good man." I said, "He is." He had a moment of weakness. He knows it. Gerald said, "I expect the next 8 years are going to look pretty different from the last 8. I said, "That's usually how it goes when the truth comes out in a room." He laughed. He said, "All right, Walter. You take care of those oak trees." I said I would. I told him to enjoy the workshop. He said, "Oh, I intend to." After I hung up, I stood at the front window and looked at those trees. April was almost over. The leaves were full now, no longer the light tentative green of early spring, but the deep settled green of a tree that has decided to stay. I thought about something Devin said when he called to check on me after that Friday. He said, "You know what I always remembered about working for you, Mr. Walt? You used to say that the best thing you can put into a structure is the truth of it. You said if you frame the thing right, if you get the bones true, the rest can be built on top of it. Everything else can be fixed." He said, "I thought about that a lot over the years, more than just about houses. I thought about it now. The bones of this family had been tested, and they had held, not perfectly, not without cost. There were cracks to fill and joints to tighten, and that work would take time. But the frame was true. The foundation was still mine." I went to the kitchen and put on Het's coffee and called Marcus to see if he wanted to come over for dinner. He said yes before I finished asking. He said he'd bring his daughter because she'd been asking when she could see my workshop in the garage. She is 11 years old and apparently interested in woodworking. I told Marcus to tell her I'd find a project for us to start. He said, "Mr. Walt, you've been saying that to kids in this neighborhood for 40 years. I said, "I know." He said, "It always worked out." I said, "I know that too."